Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture. We are still looking at utilitarianism, but we're going to look at it from the perspective of John Stuart Mill, J.S. Mill. J.S. Mill was an English philosopher. He was Jeremy Bentham's godson, and he was a member of the British Parliament. And philosophy was kind of a side job for Mill in many respects. But I have down here below the portrait of Mill a series of rules will create the greatest amount of happiness for all. Greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Well, Mill had a number of problems with the utilitarianism of Bentham. One problem that Mill had was that Bentham never really considered the happiness of the utilitarian. One of the things to understand, again, utilitarianism, you seek the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, but if you're not personally within the greatest number, then your own personal happiness has to be sacrificed for, the greater number. Here's an example to explain that. Let's say that you have a couple that wants to get married. There is one difference between them, but it's not an issue they personally, consider to be an issue. And that's that they have different religious views. That one's a Catholic and the other's a Protestant. For the sake of argument, we'll say that the bride is the Catholic, the would-be bride is the Catholic, and her great-grandmother, who is the big, matriarch of the family, she informs her great-granddaughter, don't marry anyone outside of your religion. And when this great-grandmother says something, her word pretty much goes. Now, what could be done in this scenario? Well, one thing that could happen is that the would-be groom could convert to Catholicism, and that would solve the whole issue. But let's say he doesn't want to do that. Okay, so looking at the hedonistic calculus, we seek pleasure and we avoid pain at all cost, and Bentham looks at things like the intensity and the duration and whatnot. So while you would have on the pleasurable side the would-be bride and groom being happy, on the painful side you would have the bride's family all the way down. So if we were to look at this on sheer numbers, this marriage could not take place. And that was something that Mill had trouble with, because the happiness of the utilitarian, himself or herself, is not really considered because of the numbers game. Greatest amount of good for greatest number. Well, if you're not within the greatest amount of good, well, you're thrown out. And, kind of referenced earlier, but Mill had trouble with utilitarianism as simply a game of numbers. The previous example certainly mentioned this, but when we looked at the criticisms of Bentham, this was also, talked about as well. It being a game of numbers and all the other criticisms related to this. So, from Mill's perspective, kind of adding this, there are higher pleasures and there are lower pleasures, or that quality matters, not just quantity. And I'm going to read from a portion of the primary source, Utilitarianism, in the textbook from J.S. Mill. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. If I am asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all, or almost all, who have experience with both, give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, they would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure, which their nature is capable of. We are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. Now it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals, for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. They would not resign what they possess more than he, for the most complete satisfaction of all the desires which they have in common with him. If they ever fancy they would, it is only in cases of unhappiness so extreme that to escape from it they would exchange their lot for almost any other, however undesirable in their own eyes. A being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. We may give what explanation we please of this unwillingness. We may attribute it to pride, a name which is given indiscriminately to some of the most and to some of the least estimable feelings of which mankind are capable. We may refer it to the love of liberty and personal independence, an appeal to which was with the Stoics one of the most effective means for the incalculation of it. To the love of power, or to the love of excitement, both of which do really enter into and contribute to it. But its most appropriate appellation is a sense of dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or another, and in some, though by no means inexact, proportion to their higher faculties, and which is so essential a part of the happiness of those in which it is strong, that nothing which conflicts with it could be, otherwise than momentarily an object of desire to them. Whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, that the superior being in anything like equal circumstances is not happier than the inferior, confounds the two very different ideas of happiness and content. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied, and a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, and if the fool or the pig are of different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. And quite a bit I read there from J.S. Mill, but essentially, there are higher pleasures and there are lower pleasures, or, quality matters, not just quantity. It's not all about numbers. There's quality in decision making. There's a higher pleasure in decision making. Give an example of what Mill would be getting at. Let's consider working to earn your money versus panhandling or begging for money. When I worked, When I worked at the Branson Convention Center as a steward, I grossed within a day about $75, we'll say. And, that type of job, it's hard work and it's work that's not always appreciated. Well, let's compare that to someone panhandling down on the square. Let's say that this individual panhandling encounters 100 people throughout the day. 80 of them ignore said individual, but 20 give the person $5. That's $100, all tax-free. And if we look at numbers alone, 100 is more than 75. Mill would respond back that, no, it's not all about numbers here. There's the higher pleasure and there's the lower pleasure. Working to earn your pay is the higher pleasure because it is more respected. And if the person who's panhandling was to experience working to earn his or her pay, he or she would not return to panhandling unless he or she had no choice in the matter. That again, there's a higher pleasure, there's a lower pleasure, and the higher pleasure will always win out. Well, we're going to stop here, and when we come back, we will finish what we have left with Mill. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.